With all the major changes that have happened in Next.js over the past couple of years, there's several different ways that you can handle form submissions and validation, etc. So let's talk through all those options. We'll talk about using server actions. We'll use the useFormState hook. We'll use the useFormStatus hook. We'll look at integrating all of those things with React Hook Form. We'll build some validation from scratch. We'll do it all. So let's talk about how to handle your forms in Next.js 15. All right, the first thing you'll want to know is there is a GitHub repository with all these different examples inside of it. And so what you'll see if you run this is there's different tabs that kind of show the same form, but then show that with using different options. So server action, useFormState with custom client validation, and then using React Hook Form as well. So we're going to go through and kind of build all of these individually. We'll kind of do this progressively where we start with one demo, then we solve a few problems and continue to add more and more functionality. So the link to the GitHub repository is in the description below, so you can go and grab all the source code that way. But I have a command, new next, to be able to create a new Next.js project, and we'll call this Next.js forms demo. And I'll use all the defaults here. So we'll use TypeScript, ESLint, Tailwind, source directory, app router, and then I don't need to customize the alias. I asked this in my previous video. I'm curious, what of those options do you typically do? Do you keep TypeScript, ESLint, Tailwind, etc.? Let me know what you think in the comments below. But after I have that done, I am going to open this inside of the same window, if I type that correctly, that I'm in. So this should be Next.js forms demo. There we go. So we have that open. Let's kill the finished version and let's run now this new one. So what we're going to do is end up just kind of wiping out the things that are inside of the page file. So inside of page, we have our main, and we can just get rid of everything inside of there because we don't really need that. So this is where we're going to put the majority of our content, and we're going to get our content, or the content here is really just going to be the form. And so we can create inside of our source directory a components directory, and then we will start with just creating a form, or we can call this a deal form component, so TSX. And then I have a shortcut to generate a React component, and we can give this a form tag and just say deal form still. And then inside of our page, we can now get our deal form component. So if we go and look at this while on localhost 3000 and refresh, we see something pretty basic, not a whole lot going on. So let's start to add our actual form. All right, so I've just copied in this form. The purpose of the video is not to actually build forms, it's to talk about how to handle forms. So let's just look at what we have. We have our form container, then each one of our label and inputs are wrapped in a div to give some spacing with Flexbox. So we give a gap of Y4 in between the groups of labels and inputs. And a couple things in here, we make sure that each one of these has an HTML4 for the label. We make sure that that is referencing then the name of the input here, or the ID of the input here, sorry. Name is going to be used for when we do the form submissions. And so we have properties for the name, we have properties for the link, we have properties for a coupon code or inputs for these, and then we also have a discount percentage as well. So if we save this, and I added two more classes, these right here, so max width of 4XL and MX auto, just to give a max width of this and then center this. So this is a form kind of how you would expect. And if I enable developer mode on here, you can see when we actually submit this, this will by default just do a submission to a GET request where we have the properties inside of the query parameters for each one of these form elements. So let's talk about validation first. We will use Zod validation, but let's also just use the built-in HTML validation in forms as well. So for these inputs, for like the name, for example, we might want this to be required. We may want this to have a min length of something like 5 to make sure it's like probably something valid. If someone submits a deal where the name is the letter A, that's probably not a good thing. We also can do required for the link, and then I'm going to copy in a pattern. This is just a regex pattern that you've probably copied before from Stack Overflow somewhere. But this is a regex pattern to match a URL that does include HTTP S at the beginning. And then we can also, interestingly, so if we just save this and give something for the name and then try to submit the link, you can actually add a custom validation message to this with title, which is interesting because you can't do this with all of the built-in validations. And I think this is a big reason why people go to custom validation, which we'll do in a minute. But this can say something like, please enter a valid URL. And you'll see this pop up as like a subtext. So let's try to do this again here and submit. And you can see it adds this as like a subtext to the form. We can make this a little bit bigger to be a little more obvious too. So we'll have that. Then on our coupon code, we want this to be required as well. And then we may have, again, a min length of something like 5. And then if we go down to our input here, we want to make sure or call out for you, this is of type number. We want this to be a valid coupon percentage. So that means we'll have a min of 1 and a max of 100. And then we'll also make this required as well. So a couple of things that this does for us, if we refresh the page and start, if we try to submit, it blocks it. It then takes you back to the first field that has an issue. So as we go through and submit, it will call all these things out for us, which actually does a pretty good job. Now, again, we'll show custom validation in a second, but just to show that all of these are working, should meet the whole thing. And then if I did 0 for this, submit, and then made this 10, I should be able to submit. And that again goes back to the query parameters up there. So what we're going to do is create an action for this. But before we do, I want to give a shout out to the sponsor of this video, which is one of my favorite platforms, and that is Daily.dev. Now, a lot of people ask me, how do I stay so up to date with what's going on in the JavaScript ecosystem? Because it changes every single day. And my answer always includes Daily.dev. So this is an extension that you can add in Chrome, or you could just go to the homepage itself. And inside of here, you get a curated list of articles and videos that are curated based on your preferences and your interests. Now, one of the things you'll notice is a lot of the items that are top in my feed include the hashtag of JavaScript. Now, JavaScript ecosystem as a whole, as I said, changes every single day. So this is something that I benefit from a lot, is seeing what are the different frameworks, what are the things people are talking about, etc. You can also go and search by tag, and you'll see that JavaScript actually pops up on popular tags here, and see content that's specifically curated for JavaScript developers. So if you're interested in an easy, streamlined way to stay up to date with the most relevant content in the JavaScript ecosystem, Daily.dev is an awesome way to go. So what we want to do is create an action for this. Now, I've been kind of experimenting with a new way to organize files inside of the app directory. And one of the things that we can do is we can add folders that are underscore, and this will basically be ignored by the router system. So inside of this actions folder, I'm going to create a file and just call this form handler. And then inside of this form handler, we're going to create our function, our action that's actually going to run on the server. So the first thing we need to do, and I often forget this in a lot of my stuff, is to mark this with useServer. And then from here, we can export a function, form handler. I like to name these with action at the end, so it's really obvious that it's an action that's going to run on the server. So when I call that, I think it's more obvious for me. And then actions by default are going to take in a parameter of form data. So this is the form data that comes from, as you'd expect, the form. And then we can just open up this function. And the first thing we want to do is actually do validation on this data. And so what we're going to do is install Zod. Now, if you've watched any other tutorials, or if you look at the Next.js documentation, this has kind of become the standard. And that's okay. That works for us. So what we're going to do is inside of app directory, we could also create a new folder called schemas. And I'm curious what you all think about this folder system inside of the app directory as opposed to inside of source. I don't feel very strongly either way, but it is kind of interesting. So inside of schemas, we're going to create our deal.ts. And what we're going to do inside of there is create a schema for our individual deal. So inside of our schema, we're going to import Z from Zod. And then we're going to create and export this schema. So this will be deal schema. And this will come from z.object. and then we'll pass in an object with all of our properties. So the first property we'll have, this will just match all the things we just did. We'll have a string for name, and then we'll also have a min of 1. And then we can start to add in here our custom validation messages. And we actually said this should be 5. So name should have at least 5 characters. And then inside of this one, we can pass in a configuration object with a message property, and this will be name is required. So we're adding these custom validation messages so that these are ones that we can pass directly back to the front end and display those accordingly. We'll have our link, and this is going to be a z.string, and then we'll put that configuration property again. So not a string in here, but an object. And this message will be link is required. And then we'll call the URL or link URL property. And then in here, we'll say link must be a valid URL. And then we're just kind of going down the line and kind of converting what we've already done inside of our form HTML validation to match on the server. So our coupon code will be a string. It'll have that configuration message. We'll say coupon code is required. And then we'll also have on here another min length, min of 5, and then say coupon code should have at least 5 characters. Little repetitive in here, but we're making sure we get validation for all these inputs. And then lastly, we'll have a discount. Now this one's slightly different because we're going to need to call the coerce property. And from coerce, we can tell this to call the number. And so basically what we're saying is we're going to get a value from formData.get of discount is going to pass us a string, and we want to coerce that to a number. And if something there goes wrong, we'll say discount percentage is required. That should be a string like so. And then we'll have a min, and then the min will be 1, and we'll say discount percentage must be greater than 1. And then lastly, we'll have our max, and we'll say a max of 100. Discount percentage must be less than 100, or less than or equal to. I don't know what the best way to say that is. Anyway, less than or equal to 100. So we have this Zod validation there. Now inside of our action, remember this is something that runs on the server, and we're basically just getting the form data as is submitted to us. So inside of here, we need to actually create an object called like unvalidated deal. And inside of here, we're going to grab every individual property that we need from the form data. So our name property is going to come from formData.get, and it's going to get name. And then I'm going to copy this a couple times, and then we'll just update this for the rest. So link here, link. This one is coupon code. This one is discount, and then we'll go and get the keys as well. Discount and coupon code. All right, so this is the unvalidated data. Now we want to get the validated response from Zod, and so we're going to import our schema, deal schema, so that should get the auto import up there. And then we'll call safe parse. What safe parse means is this is not going to throw an error. It's going to return back an object to us that has the error. So we'll pass in the unvalidated data, and then from here, we want to check to see if that thing is actually valid. So we can see inside of here, if the validated.success, if that's not true, so if it's not successful, we need to do something. And so let's just say we're going to return back an empty object for now. We'll come back to this in a second. Otherwise, we can return back an object with a success message. And this is going to be deal added successfully. Now, obviously, at this point, this is where you would go and take this and save it to a database or something like that. But for now, we're just working on the form and handling that and validating it. We're not working on actual submission to a database. Now, one of the things that I like to do in here is define a return type. So inside of app directory, I'm going a little overboard with this. I'm going to create a types _ types directory. and then we'll have a types file for our deal. So deal.ts. And then inside of here, I want to define an interface for our deal form state. So this is the thing that we're going to return. This is going to have a list of errors if there are any. And this thing is going to be a string map. So I created a couple of helper interfaces in here to define objects, in this case, where the keys are strings and the values are strings. The string to Boolean map is a key of string and a Boolean or a value of Boolean. So our errors is going to be a string map. And then inside of here, we can make that optional. So there's different ways that you could handle this. I'm going to make all of these properties optional now, but know that you could do unions and different things like that to get a better TypeScript object. We may need to return some sort of data. This is often something we need to do. So we can do an any in here. We could also do this as a generic. I didn't do this, I think, in the original code, but we could type this with a type T and then return data of that type. So if we do return data, it will return based on that generic type. And then we eventually will have something called blurs. So this will be a string to Boolean map. This basically just keeps track of which one of our inputs when we do manual client-side validation has already been blurred. So we're not going to use that for a little bit, but we can at least reference it here. So then inside of our form handler action, again, we're just kind of defining a function that's going to run on the server here. We can tell that this is going to return a promise. Assume that we're doing like asynchronous, like sending stuff to a database, but it'll return a promise of deal form state. And then we'll get that import. And that should be fine. And in this case, I don't know if we are successful. I think we're just sending back in a success message. So we could actually type this and say undefined. And then we'll close that out. So in this case, we're not going to return any data in this function, although we might in the future. So just to recap, we've defined a function that runs on the server. We get the unvalid data from the form. We then validate that with our schema. We check the success message. If it's not successful, right now we're returning an empty object. If we are successful, we just return back a successful message. Now, one of the things I don't like is, let's actually look in here. Let's do console log of the validated dot error. And I want to show you what this looks like, because I always convert these into something I think that makes more sense. So let's first wire this up, and then we'll see what those errors looks like. So inside of deal form component, now directly on our form, we can add our action, and we can call this our form, or we can call our form handler action. So inside of our form running on the client, which we need to, well, eventually we'll specify this to run on the client, but inside of our markup for the client, we call, or we set the action to be this function, and Next.js is going to take care of behind the scenes, making the HTTP request to that backend function, getting the response, etc. This also will work with progressive enhancement, which we'll see in a second. So let's get rid of the min length on the input for name. I just want to trigger an error on the backend, and let's go back to the just the root of the page. So we can get rid of this really long URL, and let's have just one letter here. And then we'll have a website and then a coupon code and a percentage. And let's submit this. And let's just see on the server is where we get those error messages, which makes sense because that was an action that runs on the server. And so what happens is inside of that error object, you get an array of issues. Now, my problem with this is the path property, which should be the key of the name of the input or the property on the object that has the issue. It actually gives you this as an array, which is not super helpful. So what I did is, again, going a little overboard and including all of these files inside of the app directory, is create a utils file for I guess, I don't know, errors maybe. We could kind of call that whatever we want. And inside of here, I'm going to just copy in a function to convert that into something that I want to work with. So inside of here, what we're going to have is we're going to take in that Zod error, and then we're going to return back a string map. Now, the string map is basically key of the name of the input and the value being the actual error message. So what this does is iterate through each one of these issues, and it calls reduce. So it starts with an empty object. It then sets has access to the accumulator and the issue itself. So the issue, as we're iterating through it, the accumulator is the object that we're building up. And then we just say for the key at that path, which is the name, we set that as the key inside of the accumulator and then add the value as the issue.message. So what we'll see now is we will go back into our form handler and we will say errors equals, and then we'll call that function that we just created. So convert Zod Errors, we get the import there, and then pass in validated.error. All right, and then we will return back those errors. So those types match based on our return type, which is good. So that will actually return the errors. Now the problem is we're not actually doing anything with those errors. And so what I think we should do is add some logic in here to be able to handle the response that comes back from calling this action. And that often means taking this outside of the action directly and defining a function in here that then calls the action. Now, the one thing I do want to show though is this will make a fetch request. So if I click submit, this is making a fetch request. If I disable JavaScript in here, you can do, if you're on Mac, Command-Shift-P to open up this window. If you disable JavaScript in here and we say boop, boop, and boop, this is really important, it will default back to the way that these submissions have worked in the past. And so that will work as a method of post. So this is now making that post request. Because we define it with an action, it's going to go ahead and give it a default of the method post. So if JavaScript's not enabled, it will just make that post request. So that is actually pretty cool. And just to show this, we should be able inside of the action, let's do this really quickly. Received post with no JavaScript. All right, let's just try that one more time. So we submit, it should make, if we fill out the data like this, we submit, it should then log on here to say received post with not JavaScript. So I think that's pretty cool, as it is working towards progressive enhancement where if the JavaScript hasn't loaded or you don't have it at all, it will still work. But from here, what I want to do is come back into the form, and I want to define a function handle form submit. And this is going to take, it's going to be an async function. It's going to take in form data. And then inside of here, we're going to then call our action. So what we're going to do is set the action to be our handle form submit. And then we're going to call our form handler action. We're going to pass in that same form data. And then we're going to destructure the errors and the success message. Now, because we're running code on the client now, we need to go ahead and mark this as a use client component. And then what we should be able to see is if we then log the errors or the success message, we should see those in the client now in the browser. So if we try to submit and do this, we should see an error message for the, I don't know if I refresh the page after we got JavaScript back. Let's check that one more time. So let's do that, and submit. Okay, cool. So you see we get back this object that has key value pairs where the name is the input, the name of the input, and then the associated error message. So we're actually getting that back from the server. And if we were to clean this up, we should get a success message. So deal added successfully. So that's pretty cool. The problem though is if we disable JavaScript, we're no longer going to get all those same advantages. So if we were to refresh this with no JavaScript and then type in data and type that in and click submit, nothing's really going to happen because it doesn't really know what to do. And you can see I added a log on the server that doesn't show up there. So we're actually missing out on the progressive enhancement here, which is something we'll come back and fix in a minute. Now, with those error messages, though, one thing that we can do is we can use state inside of here. So we can use a use state. And we can say that this use state is going to be of type of string map. Remember that matches our errors, and it's going to start with an empty object. And then we're going to use this for an errors property. So set errors. All right, and then we'll take those errors and we'll set the errors to those errors. And then that could be undefined, or errors is optional. So if there are errors, we'll set those. All right, and then we'll handle the success use case in a second. So let's go and look inside. I'm going to copy in a few more snippets. So for each one of these inputs, we're now going to add a validation message. So we're going to have a static height in here. And actually, I think that should be a min height. We're going to have a static height, and then we'll display the messages for the individual inputs. So let's just go and copy each one of these inside of here. So this will be for link. All right, and then we'll have our coupon code, and then lastly, we'll have our discount. All right, so I believe if we now were to make sure JavaScript is enabled, so JavaScript enable, JavaScript, refresh, submit invalid data for name, and submit, we should get back now this validation message. All right, so now let's talk about the success case. And one of the things I want to do is install npm install react hot toast. And I think this is pretty cool. It's like the easiest thing that we could do to kind of add some feedback to the user. And so basically anywhere inside of here, we need to add the toaster, and we can just do that. And so after we add that toaster, let's go back and rerun this. Let's go back inside of our handler and our form handler, and let's check if we have a success message, then we can call our toast. So we'll get the import above and we'll say success, deal submitted. So this is actually pretty cool because now we're able to add a full kind of feedback cycle for the user based on what's happening. So let's try this. All right, so we see that deal submitted popped up, which is pretty neat. The last thing we'd probably want to do is just reset the deal. And we'll show a different way to do this in a little bit. But for now, we could create a form ref, and we'll say use ref HTML form element. And we'll make sure to import that. And then we'll start it out as null. On the form itself, we'll set the ref to the form ref. And then if we are successful, we'll call form ref dot current dot, if we have it, then we'll call the reset function. So it'll reset the form. So we have built-in form validation on the front end with built-in validation. So that's cool. And then if we submit, we have validation on the back end. So that piece is invalid. This should get an error message here. That's great. And then lastly, if we submit successfully, we can get a feedback message, and then we can get a reset of this. We should also reset, that's a good point. We should also reset the errors back to an empty object, and we can handle that inside of our action because the action is really controlling this. So we can return back the errors to be an empty object. And then what we'll want to do is not check to see if we have errors. Let's just get rid of this. Let's just assume we're always going to set errors to errors because it will return an empty object. And we can get around the TypeScript of this by just setting this to a default object. So what we had before was, let's try to trigger this again. Try to submit this. We get this error message. We fix this. And now we submit. And now everything goes away, including the error message, which is pretty cool. So that works really well. The thing I want to do differently, though, is use a hook called useFormState. And I think this is the best way to work with actions to maintain and share state from the server to the client. I think it works really, really well. It's going to be very similar to what we just did, but it will be a little bit different. So inside of the final source code, these are all different pieces, different files. I'm just going to update the file that we're currently on. So what we're going to do is let's get rid of that. We're going to now use the useFormState hook. And so what we destructure from that is what I call the server state, and then the form action. So basically it's going to wrap around the action that we give it and return to us a form action. And then we're going to use the useFormState hook. And inside of here, we're going to pass in our form handler action. This will probably throw an error to start. And then we'll pass in initial state. So our initial state we'll define up here. So what is the initial state that we're starting with? We'll call this dealFormState. So we'll go ahead and give it that type, and we'll pass it as an empty object and get the import for that. Now remember, this is the type that we had been returning from the action that we previously defined. And since I ended up making this generic, we actually need to define that type. And let me double check what type we're going to return back for the data. I believe we're going to return back, we're going to return back the string map. So this is basically going to be key value pairs for our inputs, and we'll see what we're going to do with that in a second. So we're referencing the form handler action. We need to go to this form handler action and update this to add one parameter to start, which is previous state, and that previous state will match dealFormState of string map, like that. So our actions now have to be defined with our previous state, and this should be this. So previous state will import the string map, and then we also need to update the return type to be a string map for the data as well. And we'll see why we're going to do that in a second. So that should, from here, what we're going to do is instead of adding all this logic inside of the handle form submit, we're going to now update our action to call the form action directly. Now we still have our form ref, and then we still have server state. So one of the things that we can do is we can use effect inside of here, and we can make any changes we need to if the server state changes. So this is really key. So let's get an import here, and we can just log inside of here the change of the server state. So we actually want that to be the property, not the string. So what we've done so far is we've used the useFormState hook. We pass in a form handler action, or we pass in an action. We give it an initial state, and then what it returns to us is the server state. So this is whatever is coming back from the server, which initially on first page load is just going to be this empty state. So this empty object. And then we get back the form action that it is wrapped for us to do some things. And then we pass in that action here. Now, the cool thing is the way that progressive enhancement didn't work with the previous example where we defined the additional function on the client that called the server, this will actually work with progressive enhancement. So I think this is really, really neat way to kind of maintain state that's coming, let the server really drive the state, and then be able to use progressive enhancement as well. So let's just see, let's see if this works for now. Let's do our same kind of example where we just got rid of the one built-in validation for name on the length. And let's see what happens when we submit. And what this should do is it should log out the server state as it changes. So you can see we have the errors. And then if we do this, you should see that server state has updated to be success message. And so that works well. So from here, we don't even need to track our errors in useState. We can actually use the server state. So anytime we have this, we can replace this with, let's go down, server state dot errors and question mark. So we're just going to use the server state and this one dot errors, and let's just get this for the rest of them as well. So we can rely on the state that's coming from the server, and we can just use that to display and not have to track additional errors inside of state, inside of this component. So if we come back to our example, we do this traditional thing we've been doing to trigger one error problem. We should see this pop up in the exact same way, but we're not having to maintain that error state in the client. We're just getting that straight from the server. I think that's pretty cool. Now we can additionally do a check like we had before. We can say if we get server state dot success message, we can do the same things that we just did. We can do a toast dot success. We can pass in server state dot success message, and this should not be the string, sorry. And then lastly, we can take our form ref current, and if it's there, we'll call the reset function. So we should have the same workflow, pass in some things, submit, and then now we have this deal added successfully. Now, one of the things we haven't done yet is added a loading state for the button. And so we can create not a folder, but a new file in here for the submit button. And let's get a new component. And then inside of the submit button, we're going to use the use client. We're going to say this is going to run on the client. And this is where we're going to use the useFormStatus hook. So useFormStatus, get the import there. And then the main thing that we want to get from it is the pending state. So then inside of here, we can say this is a button and then say we're either, if we're pending, we're going to say submitting ... Otherwise, we'll just say submit and close that out. Yep. And I think that should be good. I actually added, I have one line class names on here to have some basic styles. So let me just add those in. And then inside of our deal form, we can now reference this submit button. Let's go all the way down to the bottom, get rid of this, reference our submit button, get the import there. And then what should happen is we should see a tiny amount of delay when we actually submit. One of the things I've done, you may have seen that flash, but let's actually add something inside of our action, our form handler action. Let's create a sleeper function. So let's create a sleep function. And then let's just do a sleep on the server to make sure that we can see this. So await sleep of 2000, for example, wait for 2 seconds. So if we click, if we fill out all the information, this is the problem or the annoying thing with having good validation on the front end is you have to type it all in. See, this is submitting for 2 seconds when the response comes back. So we have the full loading state. We have full error feedback with validation messages. We have full message popping up for the user when things are successful. And I think this is a really powerful example of letting the server, this is totally different than the way we're used to doing this, but letting the server really be the driver for what that state is. Now, one of the things you might want to see is what if we disable JavaScript? So what's going to happen here? Well, we're going to pass in a name that's going to fail, pass in a link, pass in a coupon code, and if we submit, we still have that 2 second delay, which we should probably get rid of. But after it finishes that, it does show the error message appropriately, but it doesn't give us our values back. So one of the things that we can do, and we define this inside of our form handler return type, is return back the actual data. So if we get back errors, or if we get errors, let's return back the data. And this data is going to be coming from validated.data. So it's a data that we've already validated through the Zod schema. So that will have already gotten rid of any properties that are not relevant to our form. We can we can pass this back. And then inside of the success, we can pass back the data as an empty object. And then what we'll do is we'll set default values for each one of these. So we'll set default value. This is going to be server state dot data dot name. And then we'll have our question marks in here. And we'll do this for each one of these. So this will be link. And then we'll do this for coupon code. Yep. And then one more for the discount. All right. And I'm also going to get rid of the sleep in here. Let's go back and start fresh. And let's just see if we do this, and submit. And it looks like that didn't work. And I think that's because we're passing in the validated.data. And I don't think there's actually data coming through. And if we log this, we can see this is coming back as undefined on the server. So what we'll do instead is we'll take the unvalidated deal data and we'll type this as a string map because that's what it is. And then each one of these properties, we're going to say we're going to get them as a string. So we're going to say each one of these properties is going to be a string as it comes out of the form data. And then we will pass in the, the unvalidated data here. And let's see, unvalidated deal. All right, so now let's try this again. So we have one character here, a website here, coupon code here, and submit. Still with no JavaScript. It comes back to the page. It shows the error message, but it keeps the data. And then this one should wipe it out. This is so powerful, I think, for me to keep that state on the server and just be able to leverage that on not even on the client really, but just like through client side code. And then that works without JavaScript. And before I forget, let's go ahead and enable JavaScript again. So that's really cool. The other thing that I think is interesting to do is to do this with custom client-side validation. Because I think that's the thing that people really jump for is like, what if I don't want to use the built-in validation messages and I want to use my own to prevent the user from submitting? So let's do that. We'll add a couple of different things inside of this. Let's go up to the top. So inside of here, I do want to keep track of errors. So now with doing client-side validation, I have to keep track of errors in useState. And this is going to be a string map again that starts out as an empty object. So we want to keep track of that. Then we want to keep track of blurs as well. So set blurs. And this is going to be the same type of thing, but it's a string to Boolean map. And then we'll set this as an empty object. This is just a Boolean value for each one of our inputs of which ones of these things have been blurred. And with those two things, we actually want to keep track of the deal as well. So we're going to keep track of the actual deal data. And this is going to be useState. And this is going to have a type of deal that we haven't created yet. So let's go to our schema. And from our schema, we can get a type for our deal. So we can export type deal equals, and then we'll use the z.infer. So we're going to infer that type from the type of deal schema. Okay. So then we'll have our deal type that we'll need to import. And then we're going to initialize this to either the server state.data or initial data. And so up here, we'll define what initial data looks like. Initial data equals an object. It's going to have these properties. So name, link, coupon code, and then discount. And we'll have a default of 10 for that. So we'll have server state.data or initial data. And then we will come down here and make sure this is after we've defined our server state. So we can now add our typings to the server state. So on the server, we're going to say this is going to return a type of deal for the data. And for this, we need to convert the unvalidated deal as a deal. So we can just kind of manually create this. We can say our deal data equals, and then we'll take our unvalidated deal, and then we'll take our discount. That's the only thing that needs to change. We're going to override that with the unvalidated deal dot discount. And then we are going to convert that to a number, or we'll take a default value of 10. And I wonder if it will let me. All right, so we imported that deal type, and then let's try to pass this as our property here. And I guess we could, just to get around TypeScript, we could kind of take all of these things. So we could copy, well, let's just copy each of these. I guess this is kind of hacking this a little bit, but let's get this, pass it in here, and then get our discount from there, and then give it a default of 10. And so that will allow us to return back that, that deal data. All right, and then for the success, we just want to return back kind of starter data. So we can kind of copy this initial data, and because we want to pass back an object that has those properties, and then they're basically just being reset back to default. So the main thing is we're still trying to maintain this idea of sending back the data that came back. The difference that we changed is that we actually gave this a type of deal. so that we could have a type of deal in here. And then this should be a type of deal, and then those things will match. So now we just added the additional type for deal, and we're able to track the deal inside of state as well. Now we're gonna wanna have a few different callback functions for our different inputs that each one will call. So we'll have a handle on blur, and this will take a React focus event, and this will be for an HTML input element. And then inside of here, what we want to do is grab the name of that from e.target.name. And then we want to set our blurs. We want to take the previous value, and then we want to update it to take the previous value. So we'll spread all the previous values out and then add a dynamic key here, name, to be true. So anytime we blur an element, we're going to pass this as the callback, and then we're going to update our blurs to track that thing has been blurred. And this is e.target, where we're going to destructure name. So then on each of our inputs, we are going to add that callback. So we'll have the on blur for each one of these. So we'll just go through and add. And we're building this in a dynamic way where we don't have to add any additional code. We just have to add this handler. So because this handler is dynamic in the sense that it looks at the name from the actual property that's calling it, it'll do a lot of the work for us. Now, additionally, we're going to have a handle on change, and this is going to be a React change event for HTML input element. So very similar idea there. And it looks like we forgot to open this and got some weird things going on. Okay, so there's our handle on change. Now from that target, we want to grab the name and the value from e.target. And we're going to update our local deal to include that. So we're in a situation now where we're going to need to keep track of in state the changes for our individual properties, but mainly the deal overall. So we're going to say the updated data is, we're going to take the previous value, and then we're going to do this dynamic key and then take that value and set it to value there. So we're updating our deal state. Then we want to do the same validation that we've done on the server. So we can say validated equals deal schema dot safe parse with this updated data. And then we'll do our same check. If the validated dot success, if that's good, we will set the errors to empty object. Else, we will get the errors from that same function we created earlier. So convert Zod Errors, passing in validated dot error. So notice we're able to use not only the schema, but this little helper function on the server and the client, which is pretty neat. And then we will set the errors to those errors that we just got. And lastly, we'll return the updated data. All right, so that ought to make that go away. And then we're going to handle the on change. We're going to add that to each one of the inputs. Now, this is building client-side validation manually. What we'll see in a second is the ability to do this with React Hook Form, which is very popular, which will take care of a lot of this stuff for us. All right, so there is that. We've updated our default. Actually, we need to change this to be our value. So instead of our default values from the past, we are going to take set the value property to deal dot and then whatever the property is. Now notice in here I get IntelliSense now because we've added types for this as well. So this is coupon code. A lot of this stuff with just basic tracking of information in a form, kind of the old way with React, is probably something you're used to with useState and onChange and the value property. So let's make sure we get all of those. And then what we should see at least is that all this stuff is reactive, okay? And then we can start to get rid of some of these client-side validation or built-in HTML validations. One of the things that we can do though, instead of just getting rid of required, is we can label this as area required. This will tell HTML not to actually do the validation, but it will tell a screen reader to let the user know that it is validated. So we can get rid of that, and then we can get rid of additional properties that we have, like the pattern and the title property. And then anytime we use a let's see, do we have a min? Oh, we got rid of the min and name. We didn't have one there. We have a min length here. And then we have the min and max there, area required. Cool. So now we're able to let client-side validation take over, which should be good. Now let's go back to our use effect and let's just check the code there. So inside of our use effect, if we have the success message, we do want to pop up the toast and we do want to call, we can actually get rid of the form reset now because we're tracking this data. So because we're actually going to use the state from the server, instead of resetting this using the form ref, we can actually just update this. And we're going to do this regardless. So we can set the deal to be server state dot data. And then just in case that's not defined, we can pass it to an empty object. So we can check to see if there is server state dot data, then we can set the deal to server state dot data. All right, so if we have a success message, we'll want to turn off the blurs. So we don't want to continue to show any validation messages on the client. So we can turn off the blurs. And then we can say else if there are server state dot errors. This means we've already done a submission. And then in case JavaScript is turned off, we want to be able to set, make sure that we're able to show all of these things as blurred. So we can call a function. Actually, let's experience that for a second. So let's test this out. I think we've got most of it, but I want you to see what this does. So let's do a submit. Sure, let's submit that. Form ref, we need to get rid of that on the form. All right, we get rid of the form ref. Most of the other stuff stays the same. If we type and then tab away and submit, we should get back the validation message there. The thing that we haven't changed though is the ability to display the client side validation. So right now we're just checking the server state. Actually, what we want to do is check to see if the thing is blurred and if it's on the errors that we're tracking in state. So this will allow us to combine the server state errors by setting those errors to the errors that we track in state. We can combine that with the fact whether or not the actual input is blurred. So let's go through and update each one of these. And so this will be name, link, and link, and do this again. All right, and then one more for the discount. All right, so now what we should see is we can have validation messages pop up without actually having to submit. So notice as I tab over, now that those things are blurred, we can actually see those validation messages are popping up. I wonder, do we not have on the schema, do we not have anything for the coupon code? Should have a min of 5. Do we, let's see, every time we reference coupon, I feel like I may have mixed coupon and coupon code. No, it looks like that's right. Handle blur deal, yeah, here it is, coupon code. You may have already caught that. So that should show, like if I tab in here, type something that's not long enough, cool, it shows the validation message. But notice it's only showing these after blur, which is pretty good. So these will go away also if I fill this out correctly. But also if I submitted to the server, notice it did have that loading state, it will still come back with the same error, which is pretty nice. But we can have this go away inside of the client and this should come back successfully, wipe out all the data, and then show us that this was submitted successfully. Now, the thing I wanted you to experience is, let's say we disable JavaScript now, we refresh this, we pass in, we don't have any client-side validation now because we're not running JavaScript. So say we pass in everything here, the server is going to figure out that there's an error. It's going to return back the data as it is, but notice this thing is not showing. And that's because we need to actually set all of these things to blurred if we have errors coming back from the server, because these things are not only showing if we've already blurred those inputs, but by default, we're not blurring those inputs until we actually blur them. All right, so the way we're going to do this is inside of our form handler action, we want to return back, if there are errors, we want to return errors. We also want to return back the blurs, and we want to have blurs associated with each one of these inputs. So we'll have name true, link true, coupon code true, and then our discount to be true. So we want to say all these things should be blurred. And then what we'll want to do is inside of our blurs, just like we did with our deal, we can set this to server state dot blurs or empty object. All right, so hopefully what we'll see if we submit this again. All right, I actually had to pause the recording to figure out what was going on. And we missed something simple. So we had our blurs being tracked, but we didn't have our errors being tracked. So for all of these pieces of state, we want to take a default from the server first. So server state dot errors or our empty object. So now we should have both our blurs and our errors in place where if we submit, still no JavaScript, we get a validation message here. This will not go away in real time because client-side JavaScript is not working, but we do have all the validation working on the server and the messages popping up and the data being preserved, which is really, really cool. I think this is probably the most powerful example we have of combining client-side JavaScript, server-side JavaScript, and being able to leverage the server for the majority of our states. And the fact that this stuff will update real time, I think is really, really cool. Now, the thing that people mention a ton is React Hook Form. And this is a great library to take care of a lot of this stuff for us. So the way that we had to do all of these pieces of error tracking can really just be done for us. And that's pretty cool. So let's actually move into that example. And we'll need to install, npm install React Hook Form. And I'm kind of wiping out a good amount of the stuff that we had, which is fine. So we don't need to track our own blurs. We don't need to track our own changes, etc. But the cool thing is we will be able to combine this with the schema that we've already defined. So to use this, we are going to destructure register, handle, submit, and reset from and our form state, which is going to include an object that has errors and an is submitting property. So this is just to kind of basically copy the functionality that we had before. Now inside of here, we can say use form and we can give it a type. Now this type of deal is saying like, this is the data that we're saving is going to match the type of deal that we have. So we're going to import this from React Hook Form. We can also take this one step further inside of the configuration object to say the resolver is going to be a Zod resolver. And this is something we need to install. Let's actually go and look. Install Zod resolver. So this is a set. There are different resolvers that come with Hook Form. So we'll need to install the resolvers package, and then we should be able to import Zod resolver. Cool. And that is going to allow us to pass it our deal schema, and have those validation messages that we've already defined inside of there. Then we'll have our default values, and this will be the same thing that we've already done before. So let's just copy this, and then we can get rid of these states. All right, so those should paste in just fine. I think that looks good. And then we can also set the mode to be on blur. You can also set on change, on blur, etc. So then what we do is get rid of the reference to the action. And this is one thing I don't like about this integration is it gets us away from taking advantage of the server, but it is a way to do it. So inside of here, we're going to have an on submit, and that on submit is going to call the handle submit function that they give us, the React Hook Form, and we're going to pass in the on submit. So what we are doing is defining on submit. So we're going to define this function. And then what we're doing is we're passing that to a higher order function, handle submit, that comes from Zod. And basically they do the logic to not let it submit if the form is invalid, and maybe some other things, I don't know. So from here, we can still use our form action. So we can say form handler action. And in this case, we could just pass in the deal. So we would need to update this. Let's make this an async function. We would need to update our form handler action to take in a deal of type deal. And then in this case, we can get rid of this, and then we can validate the deal itself. That should work. And then we won't need to get this part. We could just return back the deal that came in because we're not having to deal, pun intended. We're not having to deal with the tracking the blurs and things ourselves. So this actually gets a lot simpler where we can get rid of blurs, get rid of data, and then inside of success, we're just going to return back success and then an empty object for our data. And then we can just not return our data there. So we're just returning the errors and a validation message or a success message if it works. So let's go back, and this should take in a property of deal and then give back useFormState. What's wrong here? Cannot find name deal. Oh, that's because we need to accept this as our property to our function. So that's one of the other things that React Hook Form does is do the validation before letting the submit call our submit, and then also it will pass in our data as we expect it. Now from here, we can just say if we get a toast message, or sorry, if we get a success message, we will run that same toast success, pass in our toast message. Success message, if I could get these two correct. All right, so the other thing that we have to do is register each one of these inputs. So inside of here, we can get rid of all of these things and we can just register the component. And then we don't need to specify the name above. Now for the errors, this will come from our errors object. And what they give back to us is name, property, and then the message associated with it. So we'll need to update each of those. So we need to register each one of these. So we'll get rid of all of these on each one. Be link. And then we will update. We don't need to check the blurs anymore. We can check errors link and then errors link message. And we can get rid of the blurs check above. And then I'll go and update the other two, and then we can move on and show that this works. All right, so I think I've got all those updated. The main thing to notice in here, there's less boilerplate code that we have to write to take advantage of this. So we have a package that's taking care of it for us. The key thing, I think, is that this also will take care of the leveraging our Zod schema that we've already defined. So we get to reuse that here in a really cool way. So let's just take a look at this and see what we get. All right, so let's come back to application. Let's refresh. All right, so let's refresh and test this out. So if I tab away, it should give an error. If I fix this and tab away, it should go away. If I put in a valid URL and tab away, it goes away. The one thing I may want to change is go from on blur to on change in here. I think that's a little bit more reasonable, but hopefully it waits. Oh, it doesn't. That's annoying. I would love a combination of that because I don't want it to show up until I've actually blurred at least once. I don't know if there's a combination property to do that, but at least in this case, these will go away real time. The other thing is it will prevent that submit. So it won't actually let the submit happen until the code is validated. So we can do this, we can submit, and we get our deal added successfully. Now, the last thing we didn't do, which is a simple fix, is we have the is submitting property. So we would build another button that uses that property instead of the pending property to be able to show the loading state in the button. Anyways, I think my sweet spot in this is definitely to use the useFormState hook and then have a lot of that logic on the server and then just leverage that on the client. I think that's super, super powerful. And anyway, I feel like that was the best combination, although I do like the experience of having real true client-side validation, but you can build some of that yourself. From what I can tell, there's no good answer to support progressive enhancement with React Hook Form. So if you build a little bit of client-side validation yourself, which is not great, but it's not too bad, and then combine that with useFormStatus, you get the ability to build something really powerful. So anyways, that was a lot. It was kind of a big, huge crash course in forms and Next.js, but there's a lot of different options, and I think it's important for you to know how to build good forms that include all the things that developers and users are used to. So anyway, let me know what you thought about the video. If you have any requests for other types of things you'd like to learn, let me know in the comments below. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you next time.